It says it's recording.
Okay, good deal. Now we got two versions going.
Dr. Calhoun, unmute your phone, unmute your,
Yeah, I was
there you are.
asking. Yeah, could you please disable my recording? It says I'm recording the meeting.
I don't know how to do that.
Dr. Calhoun, do you see up in your upper left-hand corner of your screen where it says recording, it'll have a pause and a stop symbol?
It's just showing me recording. Let's see. Oh yeah, I see. Yeah, I do. Click that. It says, gives me all of the information on the meeting.
I think it's probably showing that we're recording it. It's just indicating to you that it's being recorded.
Right, didn't want to do that. Thank
Yes,
you.
I think you're okay.
Okay, good.
All right.
Very
We
good.
ready to get started? You want to do the roll call?
All right. Today is March 31st, 2021. It is 9:03 a.m. My name is John Bolamowitz, and I'm calling the TSBEP meeting to order. And we'll begin with the roll. Dr. Palomares.
Here.
Mr. Herman Adler. Dr. Fletcher, Dr. Susan Fletcher.
Here.
Dr. Jamie Becker.
Here.
Dr. Jeanette Dees Calhoun.
Here.
Dr. Sanjita Singh.
Here. Sangita.
And Mr. Andoni Ziguris.
Here.
Very good. We have a quorum.
Hey, John, real quick, you didn't call
Oh,
mine.
I'm sorry. You weren't on here. You weren't on my list here. I'm just reading
No, you're
off the
fine.
list.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Bridges.
Yes, here.
There we go. Apologies. We'll begin with public comment. Do we have any public comment lined up this morning?
Now, let's see here. Any of the attendees have a public comment? Please raise your hand. There are no hands raised, and we do not have any attendees by phone.
Very good.
Okay.
I'm going to turn it over to the Rules Committee. We can start with 46310 without any other objection or comment there. Is there any discussion on 46310?
I move that we repeal that part of the rule that's unnecessary.
I second the motion.
It has been moved by Dr. Palomares, and I'm sorry, who had the second?
Andoni, yes.
Taking notes here. All right, it's been moved and seconded that we repeal 46310 as noted. All in favor signify by aye.
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 Any opposed? And that is repealed. Or I'm sorry, it's help me out here, Daryl. Is it repealed as noted?
You recommended it for repeal to the council.
Very good. You guys will have to bear with me. I'm only working with one screen today, so give me 2 seconds here. Moving on to 46335, professional development. Let me scroll down here. Is there any discussion on 46335, professional development? It's been proposed that we repeal it.
I have a question, just a clarification. So what this means is that by removing that one part on item E, it allows for an individual who is teaching a professional graduate course that they can receive professional development credit for that one 2-year period. But then if they teach the same course in their next renewal period, they can also request, they can also include that for professional development. So so my understanding as I read this, by repealing that one line or that one sentence, it allows for individuals who are teaching, whether it's a graduate course or let's say they're doing a professional seminar, and that they can obtain credit for it during one renewal period, but then the next renewal period, they can also claim credit for it as well. Is that correct?
Dr. Pellinares, hold on just one second. I'm looking it up on the register to refresh my memory here. Got the wrong rule pulled up.
Essentially, it's saying that you can't double dip. That's what it sounds like to me.
Within one renewal period, but in effect, you can double dip, or you can continue to use it every renewal period if you continue to teach the same course. And I remember we had a conversation about this in the past where if you're teaching a class or if you're teaching or if you're presenting, that you should be updating it. So within a 2-year period. So why would we refrain from allowing someone to use that if they've been using updated information? So that was the reason behind it. Is that correct?
Yes, that is right. Because that's one of the things that the governor's office, that was the exact reasoning the governor's office brought up. They were like, look, they've got to update this stuff. If they're going to continue to teach it, you're not just teaching the same thing. So why are y'all not letting them use it as they update it? Science changes, knowledge changes, that kind of line of thinking.
Okay.
Being very binary for a moment, do we then have to change language anywhere else to specifically say that there are certain things that cannot be used more than once? Things like a publication or a one-time learning event.
Well,
If you're opening the door, I'm just wondering if we have to then be binary about the things that you can't use more than once.
Whatever you're relying upon, it would have to have occurred in the renewal period in which you're submitting it. So if you're relying upon something that happened 2 renewal periods back, you couldn't use that.
Okay.
There's kind of an inherent check built in there.
Perfect.
All right. What are we on? We're on 35. So do I hear a motion regarding to adopt the proposed 463.35 with the deletion as proposed?
I'll make the motion.
Moved by Mr. Bridges.
Seconded by Mr. Adler.
Thank you, guys. I had to take you off my video, so thank you for saying your name so I don't have to guess your voices. It's been moved by Mr. Bridges, seconded by Mr. Adler to adopt this repeal with these as proposed. All in favor signify by aye.
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 Any opposed? And it is unanimous. Moving on to 460. We have to do the new one now. Is that correct, Daryl?
We need to.
You have to adopt the repeal
Repeal.
and then adopt the new language.
You could do it all in one motion.
Well, I guess we already did that. So do we want to adopt the new, I would guess would entertain a motion to adopt the new language. I'm sorry, this is 463.40. I'm sorry. I'm moving on now. Is there any discussion on 463.40?
As I understand it, this just makes that language the same across all the boards in the council. And as I looked at it, I didn't see any differences. I mean, there were some minor differences, but it really is just a consistency of language across boards.
That was what I was going to ask for because I couldn't figure out how they were different.
Yeah, looking at them side by side, it looked like it was basically the same, just slight language changes, but effectively the same.
We
All right,
standard we standardized it across all the boards. The only thing that's different in yours from the other boards is in number 4 there, where it says any criminal violation. It lists the Psychology Practice Act, whereas the others will list their Practice Act. Otherwise, it's the same.
All right, I would entertain a motion to repeal and adopt the repealed section and the newly revised section of 46340
I'll make the motion.
by Dr.
Seconded.
Fletcher.
Mr. Adler.
Okay, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? No opposed. The motion passes. Moving on to 465-1 definitions. Let me get back to my materials here. This is simply a deletion on, I think, line 12, and then a cleanup of everything else of the renumbering. Daryl, am I missing anything there?
No, sir.
Any
That's it.
discussion? Entertain a motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt.
But I'm sorry, who is that?
Mr. Adler.
Adler. Is it seconded?
I'll second it.
Seconded by Dr. Fletcher. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? And the motion carries. Moving on to 465-2 supervision. You guys will bear with me a moment. This has to do with no more than 50% of supervision may take place through remote or electronic means. Licensees may exceed 50% remote or electronic supervision if supervision is provided through synchronous audiovisual means, and deletes methods of supervision may include synchronous or remote or electronic means. So this is more of a cleanup, a change in making it, with that deletion, making it grammatically actually makes sense. Is there any discussion?
I move to adopt the amendment.
It's moved by Dr. Palomares.
I'll second.
Second, I heard Mr. Bridges in there. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? And it is adopted. Thank you very much. Moving on to 465-13. Now this is the one that we actually did receive some comment on. I think it's interesting. The comments we received I found helpful in exploring the implications of this. I would really like to hear from the board if there's any additional thoughts on this. My only concern is that when I read the proposed rule, let me get back to this here. What they're asking we delete is that additionally, a licensee shall not withdraw from a professional relationship for the purpose of entering into a personal, financial, or other relationship with a patient or client. My only concern is that I can't think of a great reason why somebody who's in a clinical relationship should exit that relationship for the purpose of entering into another one. I understand that things could arise, things could happen that may necessitate the withdrawal of that, but this sounds a little bit more premeditated, the idea of we're going to go have some other type of relationship, either business relationship or otherwise, and we purposefully exit that relationship. And that's the only thing that I'm wrestling with. And I would love to hear the thoughts of the rest of the board.
Mr. Chair, may I interject for just 1 second? I want to make
Please.
sure that everybody, did everybody receive the revision, the revised version of 465-13 that Patrick and I had prepared?
Yeah, it's on page 26 of the meeting book.
And Daryl, I did get that. I was confused about what that was.
Okay. Yeah, we had, Patrick and I sit down and well, Patrick, Diane, and I, we all sat down and tried to figure out how can we make changes based on the comments submitted and still get close to kind of what we were wanting to do with this rule? So that is what we came up with. Now, I will say the revised version does not address the issue that the chair just raised. So I'm kind of curious to listen to y'all's thoughts and comments on this.
Well, as
Not
I was
everybody at
looking,
once.
as I looked at it and was trying to figure that out, and I think and both Dr. Brown-Mins and TPA's letters really pointed that out, that there may be that rare occasion where working with a client, this may come up. And so I think I didn't like the first language that we had where it says you cannot withdraw. Because, and so, you know, and I struggled with, well, what is it we're trying to do? What are we trying to cover here? And I do like in the TPA letter where they pulled the language from the APA Code of Ethics. There it is, and it's on, trying to see which page it's on. Page 24 at the very bottom, that part, if a psychologist finds that due to unforeseen factors, a potentially harmful multiple relationship has arisen, the psychologist takes reasonable steps to resolve it with due regard for the best interest of the affected person. And I think that's that piece of what happens if, you know, in the matter of therapy, something comes up and it turns out, well, there's this new opportunity for the psychologist and the client. And rather than saying, well, let's make a financial, let's end therapy so we can start this financial relationship. And that really isn't in the best interest of the client. How do you deal with that? That's that piece. It's hard to say what comes up or what may come out of these issues. And so I like that language that it says that they're taking reasonable steps that with due regard to the best interest to the affected person or the client or the patient. So that's kind of where I was kind of leaning towards some language that says something like that, that it provides the psychologist that that guidance that you do whatever is in the best interest of your patient.
Yeah, and to me, when I read the rule, that it gives the opportunity, I don't know, it almost, without the rule, if you take the rule as it was, as they're kind of asking us to tweak it here by deleting that, shall withdraw from a professional relationship for the purposes, if you just delete that, I'm not sure that the best interest is always there. But I don't want a psychologist to hit the off ramp for the best interest of the psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you just described addresses that. I think the bigger thing is that Dr. Brannaman pointed out that it sort of seemed to conflict with each other, and when you dig into it, I don't know if it conflicts. On its face, it's questionable. And I think that is a problem. I think we need to be clear in our rules that there's really not a whole lot of room for questions. I forget which one of the Federalist Papers it was. It talks about if the laws are so voluminous and so ever changing that liberty cannot exist. And our rules are voluminous, and they do change from time to time. The best we can do is make them really clear. And I think that there is kind of a lack of clarity here as it sits. And I don't want to go into a rule rewrite here in the meeting. But I'm curious if there's any other, if potentially, if we ended up taking another stab at this, are there any other thoughts beyond Dr. Palomares, or Dr. Palomares, if you had any other thoughts of how we could make this thing more clear and yet still achieve the same objective?
Well, as I was thinking about it, there really are two things. And I think how it's set up right now does address one of those. And it's that you shall not enter into that relationship or refrain from entering that relationship. And so it stops it from occurring up front.
Right.
I think where I'm bogged down at the moment, and I'm not sure, and I agree, I don't think writing it right now, trying to write it in a meeting is the way to go. but it's somehow dealing with it that this was not, you didn't see it at the beginning of the relationship, but at some point during it, it comes up. And that's that guidance. And I think how I was reading it initially, and I think with Dr. Branneman as well, is that at that point it says you shall not withdraw. And so then what do you do?
You're
And
boxed
so I
in.
think, exactly. And so I think that's the first part of, you don't go into that relationship. But the second part is during the relationship, what if it comes up? How do you act in the best interest of your patient?
I think the thing that I'm sort of struggling and going back and forth about is that the letter from TPA sort of points out some separation to me, which is that we as a board are trying to come up with an enforceable rule that is concrete about what we are looking at and what we are not looking at to have happen in these relationships. But the language that we are aspiring towards is code of conduct language, which is slightly different and somewhat aspirational. And so I think that's where we're kind of blending two different things, and that's why we're struggling. Because in looking at making a rule that is enforceable, that has a line, what we're all struggling with is there are likely to be circumstances that are unintentional and unforeseen that may not meet how we are writing this out, because you're sort of looking at morals and ethics in trying to put language and rule around it. And I think that's what we're all struggling with, is we're trying to address the rule of dual relationship, but it is veering over into the ethics of dual relationships. And I'm not sure how we fix that, but I think we're sort of skirting the fine line between those two things, and it's a little bit messy.
I want to say that I agree with Dr. Becker. And I think having vague statements is just an invitation for trouble. Rules should be very clear and easily understood. And I think either you have dual relationship or you don't. We either allow or we don't. And this putting it these unforeseeable circumstances and so forth, kind of creates problems. But I think there's no dearth of having supervision from other people. You don't have to have supervision from the same person if you are going to be entering into a different relationship. So I think there should be very clear-cut rule about this thing, because many people get into trouble because of lack of clarity.
My thoughts about this were totally, I guess, coming from a different direction, and that is in the letter from TPA, he indicates that, he's representing 460 psychologists out there. And as he goes through explaining his concerns about this rule, he tells us what APA's code of conduct already states. And I read that and thought, well, why don't we just adopt that? I mean, he came short of suggesting that. And I thought, if APA has addressed this already, it's probably because they've run into it more than once. And you're talking about a larger number of persons. So I just thought that we could adopt what APA has in their code of conduct, and then it would be covered. Texas law, and then also with the code of conduct in Texas, and also with APA.
And Daryl, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of the shall language, that's making it more comport with law instead of kind of wishy-washy, should do this or we want you to do that. Is that Is that correct?
Yeah, you want to, when you're writing a statute or a rule, you want to either be proscriptive, which is thou shalt not do something, prescriptive, thou shalt do this. You don't want to be descriptive.
Right.
So, we had in there, you'll see where I struck out the word must and we've changed it
Right.
to shall, because shall is the preferred term wherever you're doing statutory construction type stuff. So functionally, there's probably no difference between shall and must. But we're just trying to make it comport with how you're supposed to draft rules and statutes.
It sounds like most of the public comment, though, and most of what we're wrestling with, though, is this additional sentence of additionally, a license shall not withdraw from a professional relationship for the purpose of entering into a personal, financial, or other relationship with a patient or client.
One of the things, and one of the things that this has been a rule that we have wrestled with ever since I've been with the board. I'll just tell y'all. I remember way back when we were wrestling with it. One of the things I think that kicked off my initial looking at it years and years ago was we had an individual. I want to say they didn't get in trouble, but they had called me and I think they went to Sunday school, or they were from a very small town, and they had one of the, you can't help but bump into people in a small town if you're any type of provider, whether you're a mental health doctor or lawyer, what have you. And they were concerned about the operation of this rule since they knew the individual on a personal level. And I'm like, well, I don't really think that's the way the rule used to be written. I think it could have been read to preclude any type of professional relationship based upon the personal relationship. So we slowly started moving the rule towards the relationship, the non-professional relationship you have. It would need to impair your objectivity or your ability to deliver services. That's kind of where we've been going all these years, so that we don't knock out providers in these deserved areas of the state. All that to be said is this is not a new struggle we're dealing with. This thing is, and it's like what Dr. Becker said, it's a really difficult thing to get your arms around, because you're walking this fine line between, should you be doing it? We're trying to figure out where the you shan't do it and where the questions of should you be doing it are, because the should you be doing it stuff is, we probably ought to stay out of that and just leave that to the court of public opinion to kind of shame you away from doing things you shouldn't do, and stay in those areas where we know you don't need to be doing that. So anyway,
I'm glad you brought up the small town aspect of it, because living in and growing up in a major metropolitan area, I wrestle with just my imagination of coming up with ideas of where this could pop up. And I think the small town aspect of it changes that. And I can start imagining situations where it would come up. I think the biggest thing that I have is that the practitioner must always have the client's best interests at heart. And they come first. And if there isn't if something comes up business wise in a small town that they cross paths, and you can still, find another provider easily to do that, and they choose to offload, to exit that clinical relationship. I have a hard time thinking exactly of that scenario, but is anyone harmed by it? No, if it's done correctly. And it feels like that's the needle we're still trying to thread.
Yeah.
So I can give you a different example that might do this as well. Is you have someone that is in a private practice in a large or small area and has an adjunct position at a university. And they have a private practice in which they see a patient, and they walk into class on the first day in an auditorium of 120 people, and there sits one of their therapy patients. Did they knowingly walk into that situation?
No.
Probably not. Was it intentional? Now the licensee is supposed to withdraw from their paying. If we say they must, then they have to withdraw from their teaching position, or they have to withdraw from teaching that class in the midst of a semester. I think that that's when I'm trying to think of like the unforeseen circumstances where it's not necessarily in the control of the individual, but it could run up and bump up against this unintentionally.
That's a really good example.
and I'll add on to what Dr. Becker said. When she started talking, the first thing I thought about was, well, if you're an employee of a university, you're probably going to be exempt. But as an adjunct, you may not be a W-2 employee. You may very well be a 1099 contractor, which means you don't enjoy exemption from our rules. So that's a very, very real scenario there.
And Donnie, I think you had something.
Yes, correct me if I'm wrong, but the original impetus for this rule was to keep a therapist. I'm falling in love with this girl, so I want to just cut off the therapy so that I can marry her. That was the original reason why this rule was there, I believe. And it appears to me that we're making it easy for somebody to accomplish that.
That's a great call out. Is that not covered? Hang on.
In B5 of the rule.
Yeah.
For sexual relationship with a client.
None of this discussion here with this rule of hitting the off ramp of the professional relationship covers anything of a sexual nature, correct? Like there's under any circumstance, if you terminated a clinical relationship to go into a sexual relationship or dating relationship, romantic relationship, you still violated the rules and we're still coming after you, correct?
B5 covers that.
Yeah.
John, it wouldn't go so far as to ban a romantic dating relationship. We call them dating relationships in our rules, because B5 speaks specifically to a sexual relationship. That's probably something we ought to look at changing. But
I have a question of Mr. Spinks. How often do you get complaints with regard to the dual relationship?
Patrick, Diane, y'all, I feel like the majority of our complaints deal with some sort of romantic or sexual relationship. I can't remember the last time we had a complaint that dealt with a business or a business type relationship. Now, I have seen some where there was a dual relationship. Psychologist hires a patient to work in their office, and the board was like, no, you can't do that. That was a no. So that wasn't a dating or romantic, type deal. But I've only seen a couple of those. The vast majority are inappropriate relationships, sexual or romantic dating type scenarios.
Yes. I would say that dual relationship though is kind of a common allegation. I don't know how many times it's actually been proven, but it is an oftentimes cited rule in complaints. But whether or not it actually exists, I think is actually much lower. John, would you I would say I see it often in allegations. I just don't think that it's necessarily, we don't have the evidence to prove it in a lot of the cases.
Yeah, since I started working at BEC, I'm also doing the counselors. So in my mind, it's kind of tough. I actually, in the counselor world, see a lot more of this coming up. So I'm trying to separate out. But yeah, a lot of what I see are records and inappropriate relationships. And the inappropriate relationship generally goes away as not being able to be proven unless the provider says something stupid and cops to it. But yeah, it is one of the more common accusations.
So I kind of feel like there's a really good point here for getting this right and making sure that the language is correct, because the unintentional consequences of making this so tight that there are other situations that this then starts applying to that exist out there in the general public will make it much harder for us to enforce what we're trying to enforce without infringing upon the practice of good psychologists who are trying to practice effectively.
Yep.
To Dr. Becker's point, actually, that was going to be my question for maybe Mr. Spinks or Mr. Blamowitz. Do we want to possibly dial this back for a rewrite to be brought up as a separate line item at either the May or the August meeting?
I think so. I mean, that's where my head, there's enough discussion on it, both here and from the public, that I think that that's worthwhile. I did have, coming back to the romantic relationship, Daryl or Patrick, and it's the last two. It says licensees do not provide psychological service to a person whom they've had a sexual relationship, and the next one, licensees do not terminate psychological services, blah, blah, blah. Would you not put a shall not terminate, or is there a reason why it just says licensees do not, or is there a reason why you wouldn't put shall not on those two to make that
No.
even drive that
Once
more home, or
again,
what?
that's just a holdover of that language is from long ago. We just haven't brought it up to standard, if you will.
So that would be appropriate to put a shall not there to make that.
I think you could, that's how I would write it now. If we were writing it now, it would say shall not.
I wasn't looking at that until Andoni brought it up. But I think that could be more clear, and that really puts a very clear grammatical hard line on thou shalt not cross that line in any way, shape, or form. And anything in terms of like the off ramp, from Dr. Becker's point of something that arises unintentionally in a school setting where you may be teaching now, there is no off ramp for a romantic relationship, period, end of story.
Is there any way there could be a possibility that if such a situation occurs, like the example of university, that the licensee contacts the board and informs them about it and gets their permission whether to continue or not to continue?
That already happens. I get those emails quite, I don't want to say quite frequently, but I get them. I answered one yesterday. In fact, it wasn't for psychology. It was for a counselor, but we get those emails already. The problem with that is, while Patrick and I do it, and I'm sure John does it too, it's not binding. So that if I screw up and I give bad advice, they may have relied on my bad advice, but it's not going to absolve them of any liability if a complaint gets filed and they're brought before you, because you're just going to look at them and go, too bad, Daryl didn't know what he was talking about in that instance, and you're still on the hook. They feel a little off put, obviously, because they were relying upon something that staff told them, but that's the problem with that.
That's why I usually throw out the caveat that I represent the state of Texas and I can't give you private legal advice, and I still advise them to seek outside counsel.
I know that romantic and sexual kind of violation is more common in dual relationship, but how common is where it is really kind of benign sort of dual relationship? How common complaint do you get for that?
I've had one on the counselor side. Her client wanted her to participate in a publication, and he liked her therapeutics services so much, he thought she'd be a good partner on the book. And I had to advise that that's probably not a good thing under the counselor rules, which is parallel to the psychology rules. So even some of the benign ones come up in these professions.
But it's not that common, right, Mr. Spinks?
I certainly don't, they don't rise up to my level very often.
Yeah.
I'm operating more off of back when we were at psych board and remembering, because I was a little more down into the weeds more there. But I just don't remember encountering that many of those benign types. Yeah. It's always the extremes that I always encounter.
That's right. So this rule, this whole section should be, covering very carefully about those other kinds of dual relationships, which are clearly not acceptable. But such benign sort of situations, if there are rarely any complaints, why do we have to so much worry to put every little possible type of scenario governing language in there?
I do think it's important to try to explore every possible scenario we can imagine, so that we don't accidentally rope something in that we didn't want to through unintended consequences. But I think you're right, Dr. Singh, that we can't write a rule for every single possible thing that could
That's right.
possibly go wrong out there. I mean, your point's well taken there. It is worth exploring every single thing we can think of to make sure we don't get it wrong. But your point's well taken.
Well, then it should be just totally no. You know, if you don't want to have any type of room for, consideration, then you just don't do it. And regardless whether you're in a university situation or anywhere else, then it becomes just a rule is rule. You,
I will add that one of the things we've added to this rule that I don't know how much it's helped, but it certainly couldn't have hurt anything, and that's that subdivision B4 there. Prior to B4, there was nothing in there that told people, hey, if you're doing something that your spidey senses tell you this may not exactly be above board, then go talk to your colleagues, go get some outside, bounce this idea off somebody that you trust as a sounding board before you do it. I don't know if that's helped, because obviously if people decide not to do something, they're not going to then email us and go, hey, somebody's already told me not to do this, but I just want to get your take on it. That's not going to happen. But we've tried to build into the rule just some common sense steps that you should take.
yes.
So I just want to remind everybody that is in the rule. We've got some stuff out there to address those benign situations, because honestly, I don't want to have to answer questions about those benign things, because those are easy to answer. I go to Sunday school with them. Can I treat them? Yes. Obviously, yes. That type of stuff we don't want to waste our time on.
That's right.
But anyway, I just want to remind y'all about that provision.
And
To
from
staff,
the
I'm sorry.
from the practical side of prosecuting these cases, the spirit of it, did it harm the patient? And usually my way of proving that up is because the patient is the complainant. In circumstances where it's benign, usually the patient isn't complaining or anything, so there's not usually a case. And if a third party did serve as the complainant instead of the patient, I would have trouble proving it up without the patient's help.
Right.
That's a very good point.
And I think what I like about having something that says that the psychologist takes reasonable steps to protect the client. I think about that because in these various situations, such as the one that Dr. Becker brought up, I can see that in some circumstances, it's reasonable steps is you stop therapy and have them in your class. But with other clients, that is not a reasonable step for that patient. And so you have to come up with something else. I can see in a small town, the same thing, that a reasonable step, what are the reasonable steps to protect that patient or that client that you have? And so I think that's kind of a caveat that I would like to see in there, that it's not a yes or no. There's not a solid line. And so in one circumstance, it's on this side, and other circumstances, it's on that one. And so it's that part of where is that psychologist, where's that licensee taking those reasonable steps to protect the patient in what they do? And so it may end up in a dual relationship, but have there been reasonable steps protecting that patient within that? And I guess for me, that's how I see it. And that's how I would look at these if they were rising to the level for the board to evaluate.
To staff, that you guys have heard and participated well in this discussion, do you feel like if we took this down and rewrote, do you feel like we have some direction to sharpen this to get it where we want it?
I'll be candid. I'm struggling with kind of what y'all are wanting. Part of it is while y'all are talking, I'm sitting here thinking, how do I accomplish what Dr. Becker has said, but then Dr. Palometers will say something I didn't hear. So I'm kind of struggling to figure out how to get us to where we need to be.
I'll say this, it doesn't sound like there's consensus to adopt this.
Yeah.
So
No, but I will say that Dr. Palomares did a really good job of operationalizing exactly what I was talking about, in my
Yeah.
opinion. So I think it's just coming up with the language that talks about the reasonable steps so that we are not setting up for unintentional consequences and how the language is written. Does that make sense?
Yep. I do think
Mr.
looking at this rule, we are going to have to address it to get these shalls and get rid of the musts and put the shalls. Those are going to have to be addressed. So we are going to have to repropose this at either we can amend this and adopt it today and go at it later. Or we're going to have to do something with it either today or in the future to do it at a minimum, some cleanup, in my opinion. But we'll have to tackle. Yeah, go ahead, Daryl.
I will say y'all are not in any kind of a time crunch or deadline to adopt this. In other words, this isn't like the rules packages we've had to do in the past where we've got to have something on the books. Y'all have to adopt it, and we'll come back and tweak the dials and, flip the switches later on. We're not in that position right now. So I'm a little hesitant to tell you to go ahead and adopt it and we'll come back later on. That's just more rulemaking that Patrick and I have to fool with. My personal preference is I would say we'll let the council withdraw it, and then we'll send up a new version that really reflects what y'all are wanting later on. We're just not in a time crunch on this one. So let's take our time and work it right.
Yeah, and I would suggest to everybody, with your opinions on this, make sure those are communicated as to Daryl or Patrick as they're drafting of how we come up with this, because there've been a lot of good ideas here. But it's gonna have to go on the back burner because it's not gonna get taken off the stove because we'll have to do at a minimum some cleanup on the shalls.
Right. And if I can,
would the board entertain a motion to table the discussion on this rule?
I think Patrick wanted to say
continue?
something.
I think we're getting there. Hang on a second. We had one more person wanted to chime in.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a quick clarifying point for when we go to drafting this. It sounds like Dr. Palomares is sort of suggesting to look at the APA model language and maybe use that as a starting point, not necessarily use it as the verbatim, but it sounded like that's what you were recommending or suggesting. Is that correct? I wanted to make sure I understood that.
Yes, that's kind of where I was coming from. I agree with you. I don't think it's verbatim, but that is your starting point. It is where I see it.
Yeah, my only 2 cents is that I hear what Dr. Brannaman said about it feeling a little conflicty, and I would just like to see it simpler and easier to understand. So there's less. I mean, we've been digging into this for 20 minutes at least. I would like a rule that doesn't take it that long to digest.
Right. If we don't understand it well, how can we expect, students or
Amen.
to understand?
So true.
This is also one of those rules where you have to be real careful because your grasp can exceed your jurisdiction.
Right.
On this type of a rule, if you start delving into we got to be careful how far we reach here. We don't want to impinge on somebody's business rights and that, personal life, that kind of stuff. So.
I think Andoni had something he wanted to say.
Well, I was just, it seemed like we had reached the end of the road, and I was going to make a motion to table this pending further discussion and revision of the rule.
Board, you heard the motion. Is there a second?
I second it.
It's been moved and seconded that we withdraw this rule or withdraw.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Just one quick question, Brenda. The rule has been proposed. When's the drop dead date on that rule? The deadline.
6 months, so August.
So August. So
I don't think we'll have enough we would have enough time unless we.
Basically, what we can. Okay. Yeah. Well. Basically, what we can do. Probably the best thing would just be to have the council withdraw it. Or I guess you could leave it pending until we develop something else. And if it dies on the vine, it dies on the vine.
So if that's the case, if we just left it pending, it would be no action today.
Well, you want to tell the council what you want to do. So really what we're telling the council is take no action on it. It's under further development. and then the council just let it sit.
Does that that's different than the motion that was just made though, or is?
No, not really.
Okay.
I mean, you're telling them to table it is what you're doing. Take no action on it. So that's same thing.
All right, it's been moved and seconded to table. And I vote would table it, and no vote would keep it. So keep that in mind. So all in favor of tabling, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? And with no opposition, the rule is tabled. That concludes, let me get back to our agenda. I believe that concludes our agenda. Before we would entertain a motion to adjourn, is there anything else we need to cover?
The only thing
I
I
have a
would say
question
is,
about, I just had a question about ISCs in the future. What's the latest on scheduling those, or what we discussed last meeting about kind of doing an ad hoc kind of style, or kind of doing it like a 1-by-1 style? Is there any update on that?
I've got a suggestion that I should use Doodle. So hopefully I'll be getting some training from Miss Moore on how to use Doodle. And I've already put forth an invitation to 3 individuals. And if I remember correctly, there were a couple of board members that wanted some training. So we will try to work them in. But I do have 2 respondents that need to be set for ISC, and I'm in the process of scheduling that.
Okay, thank you.
I believe there's one other, somebody else wanted to say something.
I did, but I'm old and I've forgotten what I was going to say now in that short time span.
It was so long ago. I don't know. I'm sorry.
You can email us if you think of it and if it is important. I'm sure it was.
And I just want to let everybody know Daryl's birthday is Sunday.
All right.
Your baby this year.
Thank you for letting us know, Brenda.
He's how old?
We don't need to put that in a public
Younger
meeting.
than me.
We're celebrating some anniversary of his 29th birthday.
There you go. Yeah, there you go.
All right. All right. Without objection, we'll somebody make a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll second.
Seconded.
Second, and without opposition, this meeting is adjourned.
Happy
Thank you,
Easter to everybody.
Happy Easter.
Take
Thank you,
care.
everybody.
Happy doodling,
Bye.
Mr. Bridges.
Good luck.